Well, may God bless our class. I would just want to go over the preface with you guys. Yeah?
Sure.
And if you remember, I'm going to start with some very broad strokes in this class on ethics, because even though we already discussed ethics literally means the theory of right conduct, and morality, even though we often use ethics and morals as synonyms, they do have specific meanings. And so when I'm using ethics, I'm talking about theory, at least I'm trying to, and when I'm talking about morality, I'm talking about practice. So think about morals as applied ethics, and ethics is the theory behind what we think is right and wrong behavior and how we should go about those things. But even coming up with definitions for the word right is so loaded. And most people have never really stopped and tried to define what the word right means. So just off the top of your head, when you say something is right, what do you mean by that?
So are we taking right out of the context of our views?
And I don't mean the right as opposed to left. I mean the other kind of right.
Well, there goes a joke. But
although 3 lefts make a right.
Oh my gosh.
Well, it's true.
But yeah, are we taking that out of the context of like our worldviews or whatnot, just to look at the word right as in?
Yeah, I just want to know what the word right means.
Oh, okay, sure.
Correct.
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
That's correct.
And I guess in this
But
context,
then that's so
like,
bizarre, right? Because correct means it's like lining up with a standard, right? Or something like that. But then it's like, well, what standard? What makes it correct as opposed to incorrect or wrong? What is that measuring point? And so we could say right is synonymous in this context with good, doing what's good,
Mhm.
avoiding that which is evil. But it doesn't help us, because the way we use good in our language, we use good to describe everything from a cheeseburger to God Almighty. And lots of things in between. How is that possible? And so the opening gambit kind of is, what in the world does the word good mean? And then here's a little secret for you. If you can get someone to define the word good for you, you can, with pretty good accuracy, predict their ethical theory and perhaps even their behavior with something as simple as, how would you define the word good? So give me a few ways you would define good.
Beneficial?
Beneficial,
Favorable.
useful, favorable, helpful,
Positive.
positive. Excellent. But see, now it gets tricky, because is that absolutely positive, pleasurable, or is that situational? Is it relative? Is it an individual good, or is it like a collective good? And so then we get into all those sorts of quandaries.
depends on the context, really.
So let me change the question. What would you say is the highest good? See, this is where you really get to the heart of where people live. We're not just talking about a good cheeseburger anymore. It's like a description as opposed to a lousy cheeseburger. We're talking about something qualitatively different. And in this context, good would be even greater than great. Because this is one of those universal, absolute, categorical goods. Almost like a Platonic form type of good. Well, not almost, like it is. But what is that good? Like that Platonic form good? Or personally, in your life, what would you put there as the highest good in your life? These are the prompts I give for your first paper, like what is your highest good? What happens if there's a conflict? Do you have a hierarchy of goods? Like maybe you think loyalty is good, and maybe you think honesty is good, and maybe you think integrity is good. But what if there's a conflict between loyalty and honesty? Which one do you go with? Like you're either gonna have to be honest or be loyal. And what helps you navigate, I mean, do you choose neither? Do you try to compromise somehow? Do you just do your best with either or? How do you navigate when you have conflicting values or conflicting goods? And how do you decide that? And see, part of why this class is so important is if you don't know your own goods or your own values, and if you don't know how to deal with conflicts between your values, there's lots of people out there who would be more than happy to do that for you. And I don't want you to let other people do this for you. Because you're the one who has to live with it, you're the one who has to give an account for it, and you're the one that's going to reap the consequences of those choices.
I think to a certain extent, like, your perception of like good in that case is your core values. It's reflecting like what you will not shake on no matter what.
Correct.
But that in itself is also surrounded by those other values that may not necessarily be core, that may be more flexible based on your environment, what you were working with and working towards. And so I think as long as someone has a clear understanding of their own core values, you won't be as shaken by other perspectives and factors.
So highest good, Sophie?
That comes down to personal core values.
That's your highest good?
Well, not the word value, but I don't think I know what you're asking.
If we're still talking in the context of like actions to pursue, whatever aligns with the will of God, and then that's tricky because then the next question is, okay, well, how do you determine the will of God? And then we go down
Sure,
another road.
but we're not even gonna worry about that.
Okay.
But your answer would, see, by that answer, I would immediately begin to speculate that you're probably coming from some form of divine command theorist ethic,
Yes.
Mhm.
right? And that's what I mean, why this is so predictable.
Yeah.
For someone else, their highest good might be pleasure or the avoidance of pain. For others, their highest good may be self, or it might be family, or it might be country, or it might be love, or it might be what's the most reasonable, or what's the most useful. And each of those corresponds to an actual theory in ethics, which is crazy to me. And so that's why I think it's one of those great questions, if you can get someone to tell you what their highest good is. You know, it's probably not like, hey, could you pass the fried chicken, Aunt Thelma, and by the way, what's your highest good? But you could get there with a little intentionality. I mean, it's way better than asking someone maybe about their favorite sports team or their job or whatever. You know, right? You're not evaluating them on what they do per se or certain creeds or ideologies, but it's really getting down to that core self. Like, if you have this hierarchy, what is at the top? What is everything else going to have to kneel before? And God is a great answer for good. Now, if you don't believe in God, you're gonna be limited to, you know, it doesn't have to be a physical good. It still could be reason or character or integrity. For Aristotle, it was happiness. That was the greatest good, to be happy. And so his whole theory was showing you how you could live a happy life. And he gave techniques to get to happiness, where divine command theorists give you techniques to be in right relation with God.
Mhm.
Fascinating. So you see the tie-in with theology and all of that, but it does not necessarily have to be that way. And how I started the last class was that little chart I made, and you've probably seen it before a few years ago. And I just find this helpful in talking about worldviews and paradigms. And in the center here we have animism, and this is the oldest that we can tell from archaeology, anthropology. Animism is the worldview that virtually everything is alive and has a spirit. I say virtually because some things are dead, and they're dead because the spirit has departed. Polytheism, the belief in many gods, makes sense, almost kind of like evolving out of animism, this belief that virtually everything is alive and has a spirit. Imagine how exhausting it would be to live in that kind of world. I would still be appeasing the spirits of this classroom before we were having this conversation, like, O spirit of the chair, may I sit in you without offense. O spirit of the carpet, I will walk upon you in a sacred way. O spirit of the expo dry erase marker, may you give forth your essence so we may gain knowledge. O spirit of the whiteboard, may you receive the ink from the expo marker. O spirit, and it's exhausting. But if I'm a devotee of the goddess of education, and I'm in good relationship with her, she'll take care of all the little minions of the computers and the projectors and the fluorescent lights and the electric bills and all those sorts of things. And so, but even in a condensed polytheism rather than an animism world, here basically certain spirits get elevated to divine status. And a typical first century Roman village would have over 10,000 deities. I mean, they had a deity for everything you can think of. Like at the end of your property, the god that lived at the end of your property was called Terminus. And the god of the orchards was Pomona. And all the days of the week and the planets and all of this. I mean, we just have these pagan names of deities in our vocabulary in and out. It's so interesting. And how does that color our worldview and our perspective and those sorts of things? And then finally, we have three major worldviews: theism, pantheism, and naturalism, materialism. I'll start at the familiar. Theism, this is what we would have with the Western religions and traditions. So this would include like Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But theism, all of these traditions have two unique qualities about their belief in God. And this belief is that God is both immanent and transcendent. What does it mean when we talk about the immanence of God?
It's like
In all.
Yes, everywhere, in all things. There is no place where God is not. And so these would be the qualities of God's like omnipresence, and I would assume omniscience would be tied into this, because if he's seeing everything all the time, that would mean you know everything all the time. Transcendence is the antonym of immanence, and it means God is outside or beyond. He is not contained. So there's nothing that can hold or bind God. And I just love this because they are opposites. God is inside and outside all the time, simultaneously. And I don't know what that does to your head, but I like it. It's a good full loop experience. This God is also personal. It's not just a force or a concept or a principle or a movement. It's not just metachlorons or whatever. This is a being with a personality that has revealed his will and wants relationship with his creation. And all of these traditions believe God has revealed himself through prophets of old, that's later put into scriptures, and in some of these traditions God still speaks and reveals today. Okay, so that's that one. Pantheism, the roots pan meaning all, and theism God. So literally all is God, or you could say God is all. And this is where we would find Hinduism, Buddhism, and Taoism. Sorry, I'm going so quick with my drawings. So with Hinduism, Buddhism, and Taoism, this idea that there is only one thing, only one reality. And you can call it whatever you want, but God's as convenient as anything else. But you could just call it or the one, or don't say anything at all, because it doesn't matter. In this worldview, this is the first distinction I want to make, we have this interesting thing happening between these worldviews. On this side, it is spirit. Or on this side, it is matter. So here we have a material view of the world, and here we have a spiritual view of the world. Pantheists are monistic spiritualists in that they believe there is only one reality, and that one reality is non-physical, it is spiritual. These people are monistic materialists. They believe reality is one, but it is physical material. For them, the spirit has always existed. For these people, matter has always existed. I went to a really interesting conference recently where they were talking about divine twins, and one of the divine twins, and I believe this was coming out of the Gnostic tradition, was God's spirit was one being, and the physical material universe was the twin. But one was a good, the other was evil, light, darkness, spirit, matter. But you see the Gnosticism there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where spirit's good, matter's evil. But they're both eternal and co-equal in that they've always both existed. And I thought that's so interesting. And that reminds me of a lot of like Zoroastrianism, Manichaeism, kind of like the cosmic scales, God of light, God of darkness, and that perpetual conflict with one another. So on this side, the naturalist materialists, these would be people that only believe the physical material world exists. So here I'm talking about philosophic materialism and naturalism, not just like Cyndi Lauper, I'm a material girl living in a material world. It's not like that, although that could stem out of this worldview. But the idea is you can only what is measurable or empirical, available to the senses and testing, repeatability, that's reality. Everything else is just speculation and hearsay, or shadows. So for these people, you have a body, you don't have a soul. You have a brain, you don't have a mind. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, yes?
Oh, wait, are you, I can wait till you're done.
I'm done with the biggies, but I'm gonna do 3 hybrid positions too, because reality isn't quite so clean cut as my little graph.
I just had a question on polytheism.
Yes?
Okay, so you had said that when you worship like boss god or whatever, you don't have to like deal with the goddess of education, and you don't have to deal with like the whiteboard spirit and the pen spirit, etc. Right. So how would like a polytheist, like why don't they just worship the highest god? Like why go through?
They would usually pick the highest god they knew.
Okay.
But then you would also have clan gods, regional gods, city gods, national gods.
Okay, so they just...
And you see that all over the New Testament, right? Each city had their own like patron deity.
Mm-hmm.
But then they also had the other gods as well. But there was one that they were really putting their hope in.
Okay.
So would they spend more time praying to the god that was higher, and then if they had other time they would pray to the...
No, because think of their worldview. In that time, the polis, or your city-state, was the highest good. There wasn't a national concept. It was your city. So your city deity, I would assume, that would have been your highest good. And then the ones shared by your neighboring cousin type people, those would fall in around. That would be my assumption. That's part of what's so fascinating about the Iliad and the Odyssey, and what I really hated about the latest iteration of that in the movie, even though I thought the filming and action was great, that it was a totally materialistic presentation of the war at Troy. Because in the Iliad, the gods are just as involved as the mortals. And but see, that's the thing too. The Greek gods were anthropomorphic. They were physical beings and they could be killed. This isn't like the god up here or over here. These polytheistic gods were kind of like human projections into the heavens. Or zoomorphisms, right, where you would combine like the Egyptian gods and stuff and the Mesopotamian gods, where you would have these weird combinations between beasts and humans and mythological creatures and all of that. But you see that in the Bible too, right? In Judaism, all the weird 4-faced beast with the multi-wings and eyes and horns and all that good craziness. The hybrid positions, because it's not just so neat where, you know, theism ends here and pantheism begins there. There's spillover, and I would call this panentheism. It's kind of like the in-between position between theism and pantheism. So here if we take the roots, all, now we have in God, or we can say God in all. And so the difference between these two would be a pantheist would be quite comfortable saying this coffee mug is God. Namaste. Right. And that's exactly what namaste means. It's the God in me greets the God in you, which is actually the same God. So if you don't want to be so formal, you can just say like, hey, how's it going? But namaste is the more formal, the deity in me is revering the deity in you. Rastafarians have a similar thing, they call it I and I, but they're using I as like I am. So I in me acknowledging the I in you, but that I is Jah, or Yahweh, Jehovah. Fascinating. So, pantheist, the mug is God. I am God. The expo marker is God. The chairs you're sitting in is God. There's only one God, multitude, infinite manifestations, but it's only one being. The panentheist would say God is in the coffee mug. God is in me. God is in this room. Or we could say, we are in God. Okay, so that's that fine line. And even though it doesn't seem like a big deal, the theological, philosophical implications of that difference between is and in is profound. Down here, we have an interesting hybrid between naturalism and pantheism, and these two are diametrically opposed, which is so interesting that you'd have a hybrid here. And this would be called scientific pantheism. And I see a lot of this, especially with Indian, subcontinent Indian astrophysicists and people into quantum mechanics and things like that. Basically, they're holding to these Hindu cosmologies, but they're talking about them in modern Western scientific ways. They're just replacing the terms spirit with energy or things like that. And so they're really trying to say, hey, we believe in the same concepts, we're just using different language. We're using a religious language, you're using a scientific language, but we're really talking about the same thing. And so in my metaphysics and philosophy of origins of class, I show a film every year called What the Bleep Do You Know, which is kind of a new agey, think it and you can be it, you know, choose your own adventure, make your own destiny. And it's kind of this worldview here, which is super interesting, which is diametrically opposed. If you know color theory, like primary and secondary colors, that sort of thing, this is the opposite is theist. And so these people see these as the enemy, the bad guys, the legalist, the people using God to manipulate and control and punish and debase and satisfy their lust and their greed and yada, yada, yada. Which unfortunately there's a lot of that in there. And then finally, the last hybrid is deism. What's a deist?
God separated.
Right. There is a God, or we can call him providence, or whatever. And he did make the world, he set up the laws of motion, the laws of nature, and so our duty as humans is to figure out God's rules and to live by them. This isn't a God that you petition or pray to or have a relationship. He may or may not come back, but if you want to have a good life, you need to figure out how he made things and get with the program. Okay, so those are broad strokes, and most of these you get by enculturation. You were all probably raised within one of these. I'm assuming most of you were raised within this sort of, you know, window of the worldview grid. You know, you may have been to the left or right of that one way or the other, but somewhere in there. So if you were brought up in a Muslim country, you probably have a Muslim worldview. If you were brought up by secular humanists, down here, atheists, agnostics, you probably have a secular humanist worldview. That's just how we're brought up. Our folks or societies indoctrinate us in what they believe is true or correct or right behavior. Right? what would be other ways, or what would be other things that would affect our perspective? I like to look at these like pairs of glasses, and depending where you are, you have different shades on. And it's like old people glasses, like with the sunglasses that they flip down. It's like each one of these things is a different filter. That's just one filter. What other filters could affect the way we see what is right or wrong, or what is the good?
Personal experience, maybe
Totally.
you have a polytheist friend and you really love them, and then you have a naturalist friend, well, not friend, you meet a naturalist person, and
They could be your friend,
well,
Jacob.
yes, but I'm trying to make a point here, like say you really don't like the naturalist person or whatever, just based on personal experience, say you had a bad experience with one end or the other, that could influence you.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And
Trauma or familiarity.
yes. So let's just think of these as like glasses. This is part of my perspective obsession. And I just love so much being with people who see the world differently from me, because I just find it so fascinating. And just trying to understand why. Like, what about their vantage point is causing them to see something so wildly different from me? And so experience is huge. Our experiences are going to be that vantage point from which we're evaluating and judging things. What else? So like I said, just think of each of these things we're writing here as another pair of clip-on shades. And we just got one piled after the other on top of our, I don't know anyone who sees the world as it is. The people who are closest to that are little children. And I think it's very important to hang out with little children, because they're not seeing it through worldviews, through life experiences, through matrices. They're actually seeing the world as it is, because they haven't made these systems yet. By the time you get to my age, I'm mostly, if I'm not being consciously aware or walking in the spirit, I'm mostly viewing the world through my own matrix. I'm not actually looking at people, stores, cars, things anymore. It's just like, I'm doing a scan, I'm just like, oh yes, this is that sort of place, those are those kind of people, these are these kinds of trees, this is that sort of valley. I'm not actually looking at those people, trees, or valley, it's just a cursory. And it's super helpful for making quick evaluations. The problem is, if we do that to actually judge other people or things, it's a huge problem. Because you're not even looking at that individual situation or person anymore, you're basing it off of this or other factors.
So would you say that we can't use our experience to define the world around us, or to how we shouldn't rely on that?
How could you not?
Well, I was saying, but yours, if I understand you correctly, with the children analogy, is it because that they don't have experience with
Correct.
everything that they see the world as it should be, or as it is?
As it is.
Okay, as it is. So it would be better to not rely upon your own experience, as difficult as that would be, to view the world? Would that be better?
Well, to a certain extent, there's something to be gained through understanding the world through your experience. It offers you a different perspective that in some ways can be really beneficial and challenging, but you have to be aware of it nonetheless. I don't think you have to, the goal should be to remove all experience, though there is some religious efforts are to remove yourself from realizing your experiences, but at the same time,
experience of no experience.
I think experience is essential in most individuals understanding the world around them. Just like I would say that your culture greatly affects your perspective of things, because your culture contributes greatly to your experiences, your family,
language,
your
all of
language, your
that.
worldview, the way you dress, the way you act, all of that.
And
comes
think of
from
all those
your
issues,
culture.
right? Our, how we value children, how we value the elderly, our views of killing, of private property, of marriage, of modesty. I mean, it's so enculturated into those things. And experience is a huge way that we make value choices. But what we need to keep in mind is those personal experiences are just that, personal experiences.
So you're
And when we
saying,
try to universalize them and say, well, this happened to me, so therefore, that's a problem.
you just need to be aware of your own culture and your own biases, is what you're trying to say.
And even your own experiences, because you could have had a bad experience, but it could have been something you weren't able to calculate or understand. And you could misinterpret what caused the negative reaction. In the last class, I used the example of when I was like 5, I threw up after eating sunflower seeds. And I couldn't eat sunflower seeds for maybe 15 years after that. Just the smell or thought of them would make me nauseous. But then as an adult, I thought, you know what, I'm gonna try to work through some of these childhood phobias, give things another chance, try okra and Brussels sprouts and other things that made me gag as a kid. They're still disgusting. But sunflower seeds, surprisingly, I loved, and I wasn't nauseous. And I realized, as an 18-year-old young man, I probably had a stomach flu and had deprived my soul of good all those years because I had taken a specific experience and universalized it. And that's a problem. But see, that's what happens, I'm sorry, that's what happens in places like this. You get people, founders or other people who might have had a rough and tumble youth, St. Augustine, right? I like to call it the ex-smoker syndrome. Because they were so naughty and debased, and I'm not saying the Lahays or Peters or Morses were debased, I'm just saying, often people who come in with very strict guidelines, it's because they know their own hearts and how much they could have used that when they were young. And so I think the intention's good, but what they're doing is they're universalizing their experience and projecting that onto other people. And that's when I think it becomes a problem. Okay, I think that's enough to say on that. Give me some more.
Education?
Education, huge. When you look at people's mindsets, do people get more liberal or more conservative the more educated they are?
Liberal?
Yes. Why is that?
They're smarter.
Broader perspective. I think it's a perspective piece.
And indoctrination, considering most of our universities
But
are
then-
coming from a modern
Then that
perspective.
wouldn't be education anymore. So your counterpoint would be maybe they're not actually being educated, they're being indoctrinated by
By
the progressive liberal machine.
that has influenced our universities.
That could also be
and
true.
we're living in the after effects of that modern takeover.
Glad it
that
didn't
happened.
affect me. What else? Intelligence. Are there 2 L's in there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Physiology,
It's only lowercase.
right? Physiology. It's probably because I see it as less important than the intellect. That's so
Consciously
funny.
speaking.
I know, it's crazy. But think, if you're short or tall or skinny or fat, or if you have a birth defect or disability, think about how all those things are going to affect the way your filters. All of those are going to be the same. Sex, gender, ethnicity, geography. I mean, like Jimmy Buffett said, changes in attitudes, changes in latitudes, right? Or the reverse that. But the further south you go, the more chill people get. And the more north you go, the more temperate climes, the more industrious people seem to be, as a general rule. It's so strange. So all of these things are going to affect the way we view what is the good, what is the true, what is the beautiful. How should we then live? Think how different someone's mores are going to be if they were raised in the desert than if they were raised in the tropics. it's just going to affect you radically differently. If you were brought up in an agrarian culture or a post-industrial culture, think how different your values and could potentially be. And so this is part of our exploration, and this is because this is really an important critical thinking piece to me. And I don't believe anyone can actually think critically, but I do believe it's a spectrum, and you can think more or less critically. I don't think anyone can be a complete critical thinker, because we have a point of view, and that's going to bias us. But if you can acknowledge that, that's part of being a better critical thinker, to acknowledge your filters and say, okay, I know I'm coming from a Christian perspective, an American perspective, a male perspective, middle-aged man perspective, a certain level of education and intelligence perspective. All of those things are going to help me realize, do I have some sort of privilege here? Do I have some sort of twisted perspective on this because of my upbringing or my religious beliefs? And so it's kind of like this deconstruction of our filters to try to get a glimpse of how other people may see the same situation radically differently than us. Is that helpful? So that's going to be kind of my approach to these theories. And we've already done this when you guys were freshmen. So we're going to go pretty quickly through the theories, because I want to spend more time on my alternative offering for you, or my non-ethic. But this is a great warm-up. And are we out of time for today?
Yes, we are.
Yes.
Okay. So what I wanted to get to, well, I think we're doing fine, but next we're going to talk about, and this is all in the prologue, is what is a human being? And what I'm specifically looking for is what is unique to humans that other beings don't have. And then we'll talk about what is a Christian before we get into the theories. Cool. All right?
All right.
You shut that off?